Okay, this is 1950s Affluent Society Lecture 2. And here again, of course, we have Nixon and Khrushchev at the famous kitchen debates in Moscow, and then some pictures of advertisements for kitchen life and modern housekeeping life in the United States. And I've chosen the pictures on the right specifically because they show they're taken from the 50s, right, all and in the early 60s. Okay, the one on the left in the kitchen is from the 50s, and the one on the right is from the early 60s. So it shows you how the progress, and the one on the right shows them giving their mother a washer and dryer as I guess a Valentine's Day present or whatever that heart with an arrow symbolizes. So back to Nixon. Let's look at Nixon's president. Nixon's president, of course, was Eisenhower. And with a Republican president after a long period of Democratic control, business once again heavily influenced Washington and made the executive branch much more important than it had been before. Ike was an ally of business. He was a fiscal conservative. He worked to reduce government spending, including the military budget. But while some Republicans wanted to roll back the New Deal, Ike realized this would be political suicide. He also believed in certain things about the New Deal, that certain things about the New Deal should be permanent. So Ike's domestic agenda, called modern republicanism, was intended to end the Republicans' association with Herbert Hoover in the Great Depression and social indifference. Under Eisenhower, New Deal programs expanded and the size of government actually grew. Free enterprise may have been a potent weapon in the Cold War, but the mixed economy, in which the government played a role in planning economic activity, was very popular in the post-war West. U.S. allies Britain and France expanded welfare and nationalized key industries like steel, shipbuilding, transportation. But the United States had a smaller welfare state than Western Europe and left many major industries in private hands. In fact, shouldn't say left many major industries in private hands, left all major industries in private hands. On the other hand, American government spending, such as with the creation of the interstate highway system, boosted productivity and employment. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite in 1957, the administration responded with the National Defense Education Act, which offered direct federal funding to higher education. Now, rather than dismantling the New Deal, modern republicanism, you see, consolidated and legitimized it. And this made the New Deal survival guaranteed, regardless of which party, more or less, regardless of which party held the White House. Okay, the 1950s also saw stability in labor relations. The 1947 Taft-Hartley Act reduced labor militancy, and in 1955, the AFL and the CIO merged into one organization representing 35% of all non-farm workers. In key industries, labor and management established what has been called a new social contract. Unions left decisions about capital investment, about plant location, about output to managers, and agreed to suppress unauthorized wildcat strikes in return for employers' acceptance of unions, acceptance of wage increases, and acceptance of fringe benefits like private pensions, health insurance, and automatic adjustments to cover rises in living costs. Now, although unionized workers shared in 1950s prosperity, the social contract applied to few workers overall. Unions won increases in the minimum wage, but they did little for non-union workers in this period. Most workers did not enjoy the wages and benefits of union workers, right? Most workers overall. Non-union employers continued to combat labor unions, and some firms still moved production to the cheaper non-union South. A 1959 strike provoked by steel companies in an attempt to reduce the union's power over production. A 1959 strike provoked by steel companies tried to reduce Union's power over production. However, by the 1950s, by the 1960s, the social contract was weakening. And here's something, it's sort of a Defense Education Act cartoon from the New Yorker. This is an Alan Dunn cartoon from the 1958, I think. And the father's saying to the son, "Do you call a C minus catching up with Russia?" This is the New Yorker commentating on how Soviets' success in launching a satellite spurred focus on improving scientific education in the United States. Okay. Cold War obviously is at its height, as I talked about last week. But once elected, Eisenhower quickly ended the Korean War. Cold War tensions, however, increased. In 1952, the U.S. exploded the first hydrogen bomb, which was far more destructive than the atom bomb. The next year, the Soviets had the hydrogen bomb too, and both powers built long-range bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons across the globe. Now, although Eisenhower was a professional soldier who hated war, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, not a professional soldier, relished it. In 1954, Dulles updated U.S. containment policy with his doctrine of massive retaliation. This policy stated that any Soviet attack on a U.S. ally would be met with a nuclear assault on the Soviet Union. This new focus on nuclear weapons let Eisenhower reduce spending on conventional military weapons. During his presidency, the size of the armed forces actually dropped, while the number of nuclear weapons increased dramatically. There were 18,000 of these things in 1960. 1960, not 1916. Massive retaliation ran the risk that even a small conflict might rapidly escalate into a nuclear war that would destroy the United States and the Soviet Union. Critics called it brinksmanship, but the reality that war would result in mutual assured destruction, often referred to as MAD, M-A-D, made the U.S. and the USSR more cautious. It also spread fear of imminent nuclear war. Government appeals to build bomb shelters in backyards and school drills where students hid under desks were meant to convince Americans that they could survive a nuclear war, but these only increased widespread fear. Now, although Eisenhower embraced Cold War rhetoric, he believed that the Korean War's end and Stalin's death in 1953 signaled that the Soviets were reasonable and could be reached through normal diplomacy. In 1955, he met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Switzerland. The next year, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes at the Moscow Communist Party conference. These revelations sparked a crisis of belief and confidence in communists worldwide, including in the United States, where most of the remaining members of the Communist Party left that party. The same year, Khrushchev called for peaceful coexistence with the United States, but this so-called thaw in the Cold War ended when Soviet troops suppressed an anti-communist revolt in Hungary in 1956. Some Republicans in Congress called for liberating Europe, but Ike did not aid the Hungarian rebels. He did not believe it was possible to roll back Soviet power in Eastern Europe. In 1958, the U.S. and the USSR agreed to halt nuclear weapons tests. This lasted until 1961, when it was then renewed. And in 1959, Khrushchev even toured the United States and met with Eisenhower. But in 1960, at the end of the decade, tensions returned when the Soviets shot down a spy plane shot down a U.S. spy plane over Soviet territory. This is a photograph from 1954, an H-bomb hideaway. Shows a family in their underground bomb shelter where, according to the manufacturer, the occupants could survive for 5 days after a nuclear war. You see things like canned water, canned food. This is these are kits that you could build and put in your backyard if you had to, if you wanted to. And this is an advertisement for a government film explaining to children how to survive a nuclear attack by hiding under their desks. Okay. Thousands of schools instituted these duck and cover drills. The thing about it is no one actually believed, no one in charge actually believed that duck and cover would protect you from a direct nuclear hit. But if you were on the periphery of a nuclear blast, right? If you're way out in, if you know, if a nuclear blast hits New York City, the effects would stretch way out into New Jersey. But if you were out in the middle of New Jersey, there might be some, damage to buildings and things falling, caving in on you. So, in fact, even though you wouldn't be killed by the blast, you might be killed by falling material. So that's what this really was for. The idea was it meant to reduce Americans' fear of nuclear war. Now, the Third World, what becomes known as the Third World after the Second World War, becomes more important in world affairs after the end of the war. Even though the Cold War divided Europe into communist and capitalist regions without a war, right? It did this at the end of the war without sparking a new war. It sparked competition and military conflict in what became to be called the Third World. The term was used to describe developing countries who were allied neither with the United States nor with Russia, nor with the Soviet Union. Okay, and they wanted to develop their economies without central government planning or free market capitalism. In Indonesia in 1955, there was something called the Bandung Conference, which announced the emergence of a new force representing a majority of the world's population. These were the non-aligned nations. However, none of these nations escaped Cold War competition between the U.S. and the USSR. In the post-war period, as you know, Europe's empires crumbled. Decolonization in Asia and Africa began when India and Pakistan achieved independence in 1947. In the late 1950s, other new nations such as Ghana, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, and Kenya followed. And even as late as 1947, even Portugal, which had created Europe's first modern overseas empire, but is always forgotten about because the other ones surpass it, gave independence to its African colonies, Mozambique and Angola. Facing decolonization, the United States feared that power vacuums in the former colonies would be penetrated by Soviet-allied communists. The Soviets supported the dissolution of Europe's colonial empires, and communists participated in national movements for independence. Leaders of new nations often saw socialism in one form or another as the best means to economic independence and narrowing the social inequalities created by imperialism. Okay. Now, while most new Third World nations sided with neither power, the United States was admired by many nationalists within those nations for its own struggle for colonial independence. Ho Chi Minh, for instance, the communist leader of Vietnam's movement to end French rule, modeled his 1945 Declaration of Nationhood on the American Declaration of Independence, which I may have mentioned in last week's lecture in the Cold War. By the end of the 1950s, the division in Europe seemed to be set in stone, so much of the focus of the Cold War shifted to the Third World. The policy of containment was used to justify opposition to governments, whether they were communist or not, right? World leaders in Guatemala and Iran were both popularly elected nationalists. They were free from Soviet influence. Because both of these leaders were interested in land reform and quelling foreign investment, they were unfortunately branded as communists, and the CIA overthrew both governments in 1953 and 1954. Disastrous for Iran, especially. In 1956, Israel, France, and Britain invaded Egypt after General Nasser, right, the nationalist leader, nationalized the Suez Canal. And this invasion enraged Eisenhower, who forced them to abandon the mission and began the replacement of Britain with the United States as the main Western power in the U.S. The U.S. becomes the main Western power after the Suez Crisis, not Britain. This shift also brought American companies to invest in the region's oil fields. In 1957, the Eisenhower Doctrine expanded the policy of containment to the Middle Eastern countries who were threatened by communism or by Arab nationalism. Now, in a test of this doctrine, Eisenhower dispatched 5,000 American troops to Lebanon to protect Nasser's efforts to bring all Arab states into a single regime under his rule. Okay, now let me go to Vietnam. The Japanese were expelled in 1945, and the French moved to crush a national independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh and reassert its colonial rule. Okay, and anti-communism and the strength of anti-communism within the United States pulled the U.S. deeper into involvement in Southeast Asia. Following a policy set by Truman, Eisenhower gave billions of dollars in aid for French efforts, and by the early 1950s, the U.S. was paying for 4/5 of the cost of France's war in Vietnam. But Eisenhower did not send U.S. troops in 1954 when French forces were on the verge of defeat. He rejected the National Security Council's advice to use nuclear weapons, and he left France no choice but to concede Vietnamese independence. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam temporarily into northern and southern districts, with elections in 1956 were set to unify the country. But the anti-communist leader in the South, Diem, at the suggestion of the United States, refused to hold elections, which both parties knew would result in a communist victory anyway. Diem's Catholicism and his ties to landlords in a country of small farmers and his ties to Buddhists alienated many Vietnamese, and only U.S. aid let his regime survive. In 1960, Diem faced a guerrilla war launched by the communist-led National Liberation Front, I should say, sorry. So you see, events in Guatemala and Iran and in Vietnam set a trend in U.S. foreign relations. The U.S. became accustomed to intervention, both overt and covert, throughout the world. Despite the Cold War language of freedom, U.S. leaders again and again allied with military regimes rather than democratic governments. In Guatemala, a series of military regimes ended the reforms that had started there, and in Iran, the U.S. replaced the Shah. The Shah of Iran replaced the prime minister. The U.S. overthrew him and gave the U.S. and British companies 40% of oil revenues. The Shah of Iran, who had been a figurehead really before, remained in office until 1979, when the revolution ushered in a radical Islamic nationalist government. And in Vietnam, U.S. support for Diem led to the most disastrous war in U.S. history. Okay, this is Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. He was here visiting the U.S. in 1951. He is looking at the Liberty Bell back in the days where you could touch the Liberty Bell. You can't do that anymore. The U.S. sponsored coup that overthrew him in 1953 created resentments that led eventually to Iran's Islamic Revolution 25 years later. And this is the military junta installed in Guatemala by the CIA in 1954. They're entering Guatemala City in a jeep driven by a CIA agent. Although hailed by the Eisenhower administration as a triumph for freedom, the new government suppressed democracy in Guatemala and embarked on a murderous campaign to stamp out opposition. Now, society in the I guess Eisenhower's era is an industrial era, but not as industrial as the previous 40 years. Society in the Eisenhower era is very, very interesting because despite the apparent rule of consensus in American society, in which, McCarthyism made criticism of the status quo seem disloyal, freedom seemed to be located in the private enjoyment of consumer goods, and political debate was narrowed by the Cold War. But dissent did exist. Some intellectuals thought that affluence and the Cold War mentality obscured the degree to which the United States did not live up to its own ideal of freedom. In 1957, the political scientist Hans Morgenthau argued that free enterprise had created new accumulations of power that actually threatened individual liberty. The sociologist C. Wright Mills challenged the idea that democratic pluralism defined American life and argued that America was ruled by a power elite, which was an interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military men who dominated government and society, making political democracy obsolete and denying real freedom of choice to Americans. Some people argued that modernity itself produced psychological and cultural discontent, and they worried that mass society produced a loneliness and anxiety that made people desire not freedom, but authority and stability. Social scientists and critics argued that Americans were conformists who were unable to be independent thinkers and actors, and that corporate bureaucracies turned employees into organization men incapable of independent thought. They were usually overstating the case here, although they didn't realize it till later. Other critics worried that Americans had lost their commitment to the common good. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, in a book he wrote called The Affluent Society in 1958, wondered how American society could neglect investment in schools and parks and public services while producing even more and more goods to satisfy consumer desires. Other books criticized the monotony of modern work, the emptiness of suburban life, and the influence of advertising. But this social and critical and cultural critique really did little to transform American life in the 1950s. You see, these critics didn't offer a political alternative or influence party politics and government. What did was a very large and growing young population, thanks to the baby boom. Okay, and popular culture of that young generation revealed tensions beneath the quiet surface of 1950s life. J.D. Salinger's novel Catcher in the Rye and films like Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, emphasized the alienation of youth from the adult world. Such works stimulated adult fears of widespread juvenile delinquency and led even comic book publishers to regulate their publications. Indeed, cultural life was more daring than politics. Teenagers wore leather jackets and danced to rock and roll music that brought the hard rhythms and sexually provocative movements of black musicians and dancers to white audiences. Okay, and this was embodied by no one more so than the extremely popular Elvis Presley. The debut of magazines like Playboy openly flaunted a fantasy world of sexuality for men outside the family, and gay men and lesbians, though considered deviant by the larger society, established their own subcultures in America's major cities. In New York, in San Francisco, and in a small college town, the Beats, a small group of poets and writers, rebelled against mainstream culture. The term beat, invented by novelist Jack Kerouac, signified beaten down, right, and beatified or saint-like. His book On the Road, written in the early 50s but not published until 1957, captured the aimless wanderings of the main character across America and offered a spontaneous series of sights, sounds, and images. That book captivated a generation of young people who rejected middle-class life, but it really offered no alternative to it. Likewise, Allen Ginsberg's very famous novel, Howl, which is a poem, really, a long poem, written while he was taking hallucinogenic drugs, was a sprawling poem that railed against materialism and conformism. The Beats rejected the work ethic, suburban middle-class materialism, and the Cold War's militarization of American life. They celebrated impulsive action, immediate gratification, often enhanced by drugs, and sexual experimentation. Here is a picture from Coney Island in the late 1950s, Rebels Without a Cause. Okay, you don't notice it, but this kid on the left here is buying cigarettes and rolling them up in his shirt sleeve to carry them because that was considered cool. Of course, he had perfectly good pockets to carry them in, but that was not the cool thing. And the girl is wearing an untucked shirt. A man's untucked shirt, and that's sort of a symbol of rebellion. And here's, of course, the famous king himself, Elvis Presley, okay. Gyrating hips, appealing to young teenagers, but alarming many adults during the 1950s. This is a picture of a Beat coffee house in 1959. This is actually a color picture. It's not colorized. It is a color picture. And it's a poetry meeting of a Beat coffee house in New York. This is the beat coffee houses were places where poets, artists, and others rejected '50s mainstream culture and gathered. Okay, this is not these coffee houses are not like Starbucks. Okay, they are participation coffee houses. You went there to listen to people talk, sometimes give political speeches, sometimes give cultural readings, and sometimes even put on little plays. They'd have small little one-act plays in the corner with very few actors. It was really, I mean, I wasn't alive. I shouldn't comment on its quality, but it's very interesting concept and extremely popular in cities. Now, again, the problem with all of this talk is that we're forgetting, by concentrating on the really innovative things, we're forgetting that most towns did not have beat coffee houses. You know, those are only existed in the big cities. And so sort of the fringe of this counterculture was in the big cities. But people like Elvis were nationwide phenomena. Now, it's very important to spend a lot of time on the freedom movement of the 1950s. It's absolutely the biggest social change in the country by far. And I think if we were to have a focus question here, it'd be what were the major thrusts of the civil rights movement during this period. And really the first place or the biggest place to look is in the integration of schools. Okay. I think the most significant challenge to 1950s complacency was, in fact, the greatest citizens movement of the 20th century in the United States, anyway, the black struggle for equality. The civil rights movement, though celebrated today, was at the time a great surprise. The causes may seem obvious, from World War II's destabilization of the racial system and the mass migration out of the South that made black voters a large part of the Democratic coalition, to the Cold War and the rise of the independent Third World, both of which exposed the gap between U.S. rhetoric and U.S. realities. But few at the time predicted that a mass movement for civil rights would develop in the South. Some thought that a movement might emerge in the North, but there, black allies and black groups had been damaged by McCarthyism and limited by the racism of union leaders and the exclusively legal strategy of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Southern movement, instead, had its basis in the Southern Black Church, which organized a militant but nonviolent assault on segregation. In the 1950s, the United States was still a segregated and unequal society. Half of America's black families lived in poverty. Because of seniority rules that protected white workers and in the industrial workforce, blacks lost their jobs first if the economy went south. I shouldn't say went south. It went soured. I didn't mean south geographically speaking, but in the South, Jim Crow characterized all kinds of separate public institutions, and in the North and West, not law but rather custom barred blacks from colleges, hotels, restaurants, and most suburban housing. In 1950, 17 southern and border states and Washington, D.C., something we tend to forget, required the racial segregation of public schools, and several more states allowed local districts to segregate. Very few whites felt it was urgent to challenge racial inequality. Okay. Now, with the defeat of Truman's Civil Rights Initiative, which I talked about last week, and the Eisenhower's administration to directly confront race relations, segregation was attacked first in the courts. Okay. In California, a challenge to segregation there was led by the League of Latin American Citizens, LULAC. And this led to the desegregation of public schools in that state in 1946. The governor who signed the measure, Earl Warren, ironically, had presided over Japanese American internment, but after the war, he came to oppose racial inequality. Okay. And in 1953, Eisenhower appointed Warren Chief Justice of the United States. Okay. Now this is a huge move, and Eisenhower didn't even fully appreciate how much this would change the court. Meanwhile, the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, continued its campaign of legal challenges to the separate but equal doctrine established by the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling of 1896. Okay. By 1950, Supreme Court rulings in several cases suggested that segregated institutions of higher education for blacks were not actually equal to those open only to whites. In 1950, the Supreme Court unanimously ordered the University of Texas Law School to admit an African American student despite there being a black law school in the state. There was a sort of another law school that black people went to. But there was no way this could be considered equal, however, because the University of Texas was very prestigious and it was an all-white institution. Okay. So Marshall, again, soon directly attacked racial segregation in public education. The NAACP worked on several cases challenging the unequal treatment of black children in schools across the country. In 1952, these cases were combined into a single appeal whose title was the first case listed, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Okay. Now notice this is not Brown versus the Board of Education of Meridian, Mississippi. This is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which is a northern state, and a border, or at the very minimum, a border state, but certainly a state that chose to be free in the bleeding Kansas struggles of the 1850s. Okay. In this case, Thurgood Marshall, who was the prosecuting attorney, attacked not the unfair application of separate but equal doctrine, but the doctrine itself. He argued that even with the same funding and facilities, segregation was unequal because it stigmatized one group of citizens as unfit to associate with others. He used psychological studies to show that segregation inflicted lifelong damage on black children by undermining their self-esteem. Okay? The Eisenhower administration, in a brief on the case, urged the court to recognize the damage that segregation inflicted on America's reputation abroad, especially in the context of the Cold War. How could the United States preach superiority in the Cold War over the Soviet Union when there was segregation at home? And so this new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, read the unanimous decision on May 17, 1954, which stated that segregation in public education violated the equal protection of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Okay. That struck down the separate but equal doctrine protecting segregation. Now, although hailed by the black press as the Second Emancipation Proclamation, the decision did not outlaw segregation in institutions other than public schools or ban racial classification in the law. It did not address de facto school segregation in the North based on residential segregation, what we now know as redlining, rather than state law. It wasn't in the state law in Pennsylvania to have residential segregation, but it was practiced anyway. It did not order immediate implementation, but only hearings on how segregation in schools should be abolished. But the Brown decision signaled the beginning of the Warren Court, and I'm putting that in quotation marks. The Warren Court was an active agent in social change, and it gave hope to many that segregation would soon end. Here we see a segregated school in West Memphis, Arkansas, photographed for Nightlife magazine in 1949. Education in the South was separate but hardly equal. What you had in these schools was tremendous overcrowding in African American schools, okay, in segregated African American schools, and the quality of education was nowhere near those in white schools. And this is a photograph called "The Dangerous Walk." It's very, very interesting. Linda Brown's parents, Brown of the Brown versus Board of Education, sued the school board of Topeka, Kansas, demanding that it admit their daughter to a school near her home, but that was restricted to whites, rather than requiring her to walk across dangerous railroad tracks to attend school every day, which is shown in this picture. Okay? So the argument was that not only is racial segregation wrong, but you're forcing children to possibly go to on dangerous walks, like across railroad tracks, to get to their black schools. Okay, and this was one of many things that added weight to the argument that segregation was bad for the country, very bad. Now, I can't stress enough how the Brown decision really galvanized civil rights activists who, they've been rather dominant in the early 50s, now believed that the federal courts would back them, right? Mass action against Jim Crow developed quickly. In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a department store worker in Montgomery, Alabama, okay, refused to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider as local law required, and Parks's arrest provoked the year-long Montgomery bus boycott by African Americans, which initiated the mass phase of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Okay, Rosa Parks, which you listened to about in your podcast that I put in the module, was not just a harmless housewife who worked at a department store. She wasn't just a department store clerk. She also was a civil rights activist, and the protest of her getting on the bus and refusing to give up her seat was actually planned. Okay. Within a decade, the civil rights revolution overthrew legal segregation and retained the right to vote for black Southerners. Okay. As I said, Parks is depicted as an ordinary woman fed up with Jim Crow, but in fact she was a veteran of the civil rights movement. In the 30s, she protested the conviction of the Scottsboro Boys. In the 40s, she became one of the few blacks in Montgomery able to cast a ballot after passing a difficult and highly rigged literacy test. In 1954, she attended a training session for political activists at the Highlander School in Tennessee. And when news of her arrest spread through Montgomery, hundreds of blacks gathered in a local church and refused to ride the bus until they received equal treatment. For more than a year, despite harassment and violence, Montgomery blacks maintained the boycott. And in November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott launched a nonviolent movement for racial justice based in the Southern black churches. It was supported by Northern liberals and focused unprecedented attention on U.S. racial policies. Through the boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., who was a pastor at a local Baptist church, became the movement's symbol. At the boycott's first protest meeting, King inspired his audience when he said that Southern blacks were tired of going through the long night of captivity and were reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. So from its beginnings, the language of freedom marked the black movement. Freedom meant many different things, but most of all, it meant political rights and economic opportunities that had long been denied because of color. Okay. King's rhetoric united ideas of freedom into a coherent role. Now, later, his famous I Have a Dream speech, given in 1963, began noting the unfilled promise of emancipation and closed his speech by invoking a cry from a black spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Now, King appealed to both blacks' sense of injustice and to the conscience of white America by making the case for black rights in terms that united the experience of blacks with that of the nation. Okay? He had been a student of the nonviolent civil disobedience movement protested by Henry David Thoreau and by Gandhi, and he offered a philosophy of struggle in which evil was met with good, hate with Christian love, and violence with peaceful demands for change. His Christian themes came from the black church, and they resonated in black community and in America. He appealed to white America by emphasizing blacks' loyalty to the nation and their devotion to its redemptive values. The idea that the United States can change itself and improve itself, right, was a big part of King's speeches. He said this over and over again, and used tons of examples from American history. Now, here's a picture of Rosa Parks December 1955, Montgomery Police Station, after she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. And this is a picture of what happened during the bus boycott. You remember the vast majority of riders of public transportation in this period were people, generally speaking, in the lower income brackets. Okay, and so this meant they couldn't just say, I'm not going to take the bus, I'm going to take my car, because they didn't have cars, a lot of them. So they walked to work. Walking to work became not only a symbol of refusing to put up with the segregation on the buses, it became a symbol of pride. Okay, this is a very, very, very important aspect of the boycott. And the fact that people were willing to do this for a very, very long time was amazing. Okay. A year is a very long time to have to put up with walking to work, usually long distances. Okay. Now, as I say, people are paying attention. The world is watching. In 1956, building on the success in Montgomery, King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, very important coalition of black ministers and civil rights activists, organized to fight segregation, to help the desegregation efforts. But the fact that Montgomery's officials agreed to desegregate only when forced to by a Supreme Court ruling showed that more than local action was necessary to end Jim Crow. The White South's refusal to accept the Brown decision showed that blacks would win their constitutional rights only by federal intervention. But the federal government did not step into the breach, right? Southern whites did. They launched a campaign of massive resistance against desegregation in the South. In 1956, a full 82 of 106 Southern members of Congress signed a Southern Manifesto condemning Brown as abuse of judicial power and calling for lawful resistance to, quote, forced integration. Southern states soon passed laws to block desegregation, and some even outlawed the NAACP. Virginia was the first state to enact desegregation, but offered funds to white students and not blacks to attend private schools. Some localities shut down their schools entirely rather than desegregate. Places like Prince Edward County in Virginia, and whose public schools remained closed from 1954 to 1959 to 1964, an enormous stretch of time. Okay? As a symbol of defiance, Georgia added the Confederate battle flag to its state flag in 1956, and Alabama and South Carolina began flying the flag over their state capitol buildings. So these things that we have seen protested about in the last few years so strongly were not unbroken traditions from the Civil War. They were revived in the Civil Rights era as a reaction against the Civil Rights movement. Okay. In the 50s, the federal government tried to stay uninvolved. 1957, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson led successful efforts in Congress to pass the first national civil rights laws since Reconstruction, focusing on black voters' rights in the South, but it had weak enforcement and little effect. Okay. Eisenhower didn't really offer any moral leadership and called only for Americans to obey the law. Okay. But he also made it clear he did not welcome civil rights agitation. Eisenhower and a lot of people, including Kennedy later, really were very mild when it came to civil rights. They wanted things to evolve and improve sort of naturally and gradually. Now, in 1957, when Governor Orville Faubus used the Arkansas, 1957, Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, used the National Guard to prevent a court-ordered integration of Little Rock Central High School. And Eisenhower had to respond by dispatching federal troops to the city to enforce it. Okay? Eisenhower was very much of the mind that you followed the decisions of the courts. Okay? The court decides on something, you must carry it out. Okay? If you go on YouTube, look up his Eisenhower's Little Rock speech. It's very much about that the violation here is violating the court's decision. Okay. Elsewhere, the federal government did little to hasten desegregation, and when Eisenhower left office, fewer than 2% of black students attended desegregated schools in the South. Okay, so don't get into the idea that once the civil rights movement starts in the mid-50s, in a big way in the mid-50s, that things just start to roll naturally and improve on each itself, and things improve dramatically. It takes a very, very, very long time. Now, since the Cold War's beginning, U.S. leaders worried that segregation tarnished America's reputation abroad. This continued in the late 1950s. Moreover, foreign nations and colonies also noticed the development of civil rights in America. So across the world, people of African descent celebrated the Brown decision. But the slow pace of change in the United States led to embarrassing criticisms of the United States. And American diplomats, for instance, very hard for them to preach freedom and equality across the globe when it wasn't being practiced here in the United States. Now, here's a pro-segregation rally in Little Rock, Arkansas, and in 1959. Race mixing is communism, right? Which is nuts because, if anything, the supposedly, it's just nuts. That's an economic mode of thinking. It's not a racial mode of thinking, but anyway, they just throwing anything, tarring race integration with anything bad in America was definitely the key. This shows a door in San Antonio, Texas, a door to a restaurant in San Antonio, Texas, which says whites only. Of course, you had to go around back to the window to get served food if you were African American. This is a photograph, a very famous photograph, 1956. This is a segregated playground. It's a whites only playground in Mobile, Alabama, and shows black children, looking through the fence wistfully at the nice playground. And undoubtedly, this playground was a lot nicer and better maintained than their playground in the neighborhood. This is a picture of the Little Rock Nine having to be escorted to their school in Little Rock after that decision and after Eisenhower's action. Okay. And this is a very, very famous painting, 1964, The Problem We All Live With, by Norman Rockwell. Remember, Norman Rockwell has painted all those Four Freedoms things? Well, he painted this in 1964, and it accompanied an article in Look magazine, and it depicts federal marshals escorting the 6-year-old Ruby Bridges to kindergarten in New Orleans in 1960 in accordance with a court order to integrate the city's schools. Okay? So, Rockwell, by the way, what this picture doesn't show you is that there was a large crowd outside the school. People were throwing things at her and at the marshals, but Rockwell, intent on focusing on the child, represented the mob only through graffiti that you see on the wall there and tomatoes thrown against the wall. Doesn't show the faces of the marshals. And by the way, because of the decision to send her to a formerly white school, Ruby Bridges' father lost her job, and her parents, who worked as sharecroppers in Mississippi, were evicted from their land. Okay, it was that these things, they aren't the triumphs. They're triumphs in a way because she's able to integrate the school, but the backlash is often very, very severe. Finally, in 2001, she was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal. Okay, now I want to end this lecture talking about the end of the decade, which is technically 1960, and the election of 1960, and really what was the significance of the presidential election of 1960 should be our focus question. Okay. The campaign of 1960 was, and the election was the closest one of the closest in American history. Vice President Richard Nixon faced off against the Democratic candidate John Kennedy, who was a young Massachusetts senator and was Roman Catholic, whose father had been U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Nixon was also very young. If Nixon had been elected, he would have been the youngest person ever elected to the office. Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas was Kennedy's running mate. And Catholicism was a very, very big issue during this election. Although World War II, the atmosphere of tolerance had weakened anti-Catholicism. Remember those pictures I showed you, for instance, the four chaplains? Many Protestants were wary of voting for Kennedy, fearing that a Catholic president would follow church dictates from Rome when it came to controversial public issues. Kennedy tried to dismiss these fears by disavowing any connection between his public positions and his church. And Kennedy's the smartest thing he probably ever did was, in terms of the election anyway, was to confront this immediately. He started talking about his Catholicism and the wall between his personal religion and his public actions, the wall that separated that church and state within him. He talked about that immediately. I think in his nomination speech, it was the second sentence he brought it up right away. Okay, anyway, so the key to this, the key sign that this was actually working was when he won the Democratic primary in heavily Protestant West Virginia, right? And he was able to secure the Democratic Party against Hubert Humphrey, who was a great champion of the poor and great champion of miners in West Virginia. And no one thought that Kennedy would win there, but he did. Okay. Nixon, of course, was Eisenhower's vice president, and both candidates were ardent Cold Warriors. Okay. But Kennedy argued that the Soviet Union's success in launching Sputnik, right, and their tests of the first intercontinental ballistic missile showed that the United States, under the Republicans, had let a missile gap develop and was lagging behind the USSR. Both Kennedy and Nixon knew that the U.S. military and economic capacity was far greater than the Soviets, but Kennedy criticized it anyway, and he convinced many Americans that new leadership was needed. He had a very stylish wife, Jacqueline. She charmed many Americans who seemed to want a young and energetic first family. And eventually Kennedy wins the election, but by a very large margin. Now, in the first ever presidential debate, right, Kennedy was generally thought to have beaten Nixon. There's a big misapprehension about that, a big misunderstanding about that. Kennedy looked better than Nixon in the debate for all sorts of reasons, and the podcast that I've put up in this module explains that that's a myth, even though it's a very hardy myth and everyone seems to believe it. Okay. Now, in January 1961, shortly before leaving office, President Eisenhower delivered a televised farewell address. He warned against what he called the new military buildup and urged Americans to think about the dangers of what he called a military-industrial complex. Military-industrial complex conjoined the enormous military establishment with a permanent arms industry and greatly influenced politicians and policy. He warned that such an establishment should never, quote, endanger our liberties or democratic processes. Okay. But most Americans saw the military-industrial establishment not as a threat, but as a source of jobs and a source of national security. Okay. However, the Vietnam War soon made Ike's words of caution seem very relevant. By the 1960s, the foundations of 1950s life seemed to be collapsing. Okay, the cars and the chemicals produced and released by new consumer goods were found to be spoiling the environment and giving people cancer. Housewives rebelled against the roles given them in the suburban family, and blacks became impatient with the slow pace of racial progress. All of this meant that the 1960s had arrived. And I'll talk more about that, obviously, next week. Now, here is a picture of a flood of anti-Catholic propaganda during the election of 1960, right? Pamphlets All right. But the fact that Kennedy was able to overcome that, I think, has meant that that's never come up as a serious issue again. The next Catholic candidate, I think, was John Kerry, and that didn't come up. And then, of course, President Biden, candidate Biden, was Catholic, and that I don't think that came up in 2020. And here's a picture of the Kennedys. Lots of people make a big deal of their youthful appeal. Right, this is a picture of them in their hometown of Hyannisport, Massachusetts. And here's a map showing the 1960 election results. Now, this is extremely important because although the popular vote is very, very close, you see that Nixon gets 49%, 49.6%, and Kennedy got 49.7%. Can't get much closer than that. The electoral college share is quite different. Okay, the keys here are that LBJ was able to deliver most of the South to the Democrats, especially Texas, 24 electoral votes. Kennedy would have won without that, but it would have been very, very hard to do. And so he wins a lot of these southern states: North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, half of Alabama, a lot of the border states, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and especially Texas. Okay.